Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, The Republic of Letters. This is sort of the first time I'm making book reviews. We'll see how it goes. A couple of words about myself. My name is Eugene Kensky. I'm a history student. Right now I'm doing an MSc in history, and my areas of interest are the history of Spain, in particular its social, political and economic history, and also gender history. So in today's video I'd like to talk to you about a book that I've discovered a couple of months ago. This is a book by Spanish philosopher Gustavo Bueno, and the title of this book is España Frente A Europa. I don't know if you can see the cover over here. I've got the Kindle edition. The book hasn't been translated into English. So far there have been only 2 or 3 editions in Spanish, and so I think the title España Frente A Europa can be translated as Spain in the Face of Europe. This is my attempt at translating the title into English. And precisely the point of this video is sort of to introduce the English-speaking audience to Gustavo Bueno and his obra maestra. One of his most prominent works is, of course, Spain in the Face of Europe, España Frente A Europa. He's a very prominent intellectual figure in recent Spanish history, and in some sources he is listed as one of the most influential Spanish philosophers of the late 20th and early 21st century. He has had a lot of influence on Spanish politicians, scholars, intellectuals, students of history, students of philosophy. So it is impossible to elude the figure of Gustavo Bueno. This book, it has been re-edited a couple of times. So the first edition appeared in 1998, 1999, the first 2 editions. The latest edition, it appeared just a couple of years ago in 2019. So we can see that his works are re-edited, and there are people in Spain currently rediscovering his books and trying to see how they are relevant in the contemporary world that we are living in. So I think in order to understand the book itself, we should start with the context when it appeared. It was the 1998-1999. The conference which later gave way to this book was given at Oviedo in 1998, and the book appeared the following year. So the year 1998 is pretty symbolic in Spanish history for 2 reasons. The first reason is that it is 100th anniversary of the loss, what Spaniards call the loss of Cuba, when Spain lost the American-Spanish War in 1898, and Cuba, this island, this last remnant of what was one day great Spanish Empire, it was lost, and of course Spanish military and Spanish nationalists at home, Spanish people perceived it as a national tragedy. The year 1998 is also important because it is the 20th anniversary since the promulgation of the modern Spanish constitution, which is still in force, the so-called La Constitución del 78. So this constitution followed the process of transition in Spain after the death of Franco. So it signified the end of Spanish dictatorship. I apologize for the noise, I've got the window open over there. So it signified the end of the dictatorship, Franco's dictatorship, and the constitution, a result of sort of social agreement of various parties in the society, was meant to put Spain firmly on the democratic path. But also late 90s are a very important period if we want to analyze the book from an international perspective, because in the late 90s, as we all know, these were the years of turmoil in the former Yugoslavia. So, year 1999 in particular was the year of NATO intervention in Kosovo. Gustavo Bueno, as the author of this book, he was particularly anxious, preoccupied, looking at what was happening in the former Yugoslavia, because he thought that the same scenario of the dissolution could be implemented or could happen in Spain. And he, at one point in his book, he talks about the so-called Balkanization of Spain. So in the late 90s, for sure, I think it was a very important debate within the Spanish society. As we all know, the Constitution enshrined the administrative division of Spain into autonomous communities, And some Spanish intellectuals, they feared that this would signify the first step into the process of dissolution of Spain from a unified country into separate territories. And we can see some of the remnants of this debate today when, of course, we know the problem of Catalonia and in the Basque region, the separatist tendencies that exist there. Having said that, let's move to the content of this book and see what kind of ideas Bueno defends in España Frente A Europa. I think that in order to sort of get to grips with the context of the book, it is important to understand one of Bueno's main statements when he declared one day that as a philosopher, to think means to always to think against someone or against something. And in order to understand this book, I think we have to ask ourselves against whom Bueno is thinking in this throughout the book. And after reading it, I've come to the conclusion that basically there are two forces, two global forces that Bueno sees as shaping the Spanish identity, and at the same time he thinks that Spain defines itself in opposition to these two forces. And here I'm talking about the Anglo-Saxon capitalism on the one hand and about Islam on the other hand. So Bueno maintains throughout his book that the Hispanic way of life, the Spanish way of life is sort of an alternative way to both these forces that I've just mentioned. By the way, it is curious that at no point he mentions, for example, China, nor Russia, nor does he mention Chinese communism, but I think there is a reason for that, and namely that in the late 90s, China was not still a force to reckon with as it is now, at least in the ideological sphere. And the second reason might be that Bueno, as a Marxist, as a philosophical materialist, he may be sympathetic to China or some Marxist currents of thought, and maybe he just decided to leave that out and say, okay, I'm not going to talk about that. It is interesting that Bueno doesn't use the same criteria when discussing why Spain is different to Anglo-Saxon capitalism, and as opposed to why it is different to Islam. When he talks about Islam, he says, well, you just have to look at the architecture, you just have to look at their religion. By the way, it is interesting in his current of thought, he thought that at the time of the La Reconquista, of the Reconquest, Islam basically was representing a monotheistic religion, while Christianity, Bueno views it as a polytheistic religion because of the Trinity, the Christian Trinity. I don't know what some of you might say about this, but this is sort of Bueno's idea of ideological opposition between Islam and a Spanish brand of Catholicism. On the other hand, when he talks about, when he compares Spain to the Anglo-Saxon peoples and to northern countries, he talks about different conceptions of private property. He talks about different forms of human association. First, he maintains that the Hispanic way of life and the Hispanic conception of private property is different in one fundamental regard from the Anglo-Saxon conception of private property. Whereas he sees the latter as a negative concept, he maintains that Spanish conception of private property is a more positive concept. And he gives one particular example when he talks about a person that is starving or a person that is thirsty. He says that a Hispanic conception of private property would allow for that person to take someone else's glass of water and would also welcome another person, him or herself, to give a glass of water to a person that is dying of thirst or a person that is starving. Whereas he says that sort of Northern European or Anglo-Saxon conception of private property would not allow for that. I think that in this regard it would be interesting to mention Bueno's concept of solidarity, which he also discusses at length throughout his book. And he sees solidarity as a concept that originated in the north of Europe, and he counterposes it to the Hispanic ideas of fraternity and generosity. Why is he so critical of solidarity? Well, the main reason is that he maintains that basically solidarity as an idea is always directed against third parties. He says that it is based on the idea of self-interest, and he views this idea as incompatible with sort of Hispanic values. First of all, I think I have to say he's very, very critical of the idea of human solidarity, because he says, as I mentioned before, solidarity is directed against third parties, and for that reason, he says it is absurd to talk about human solidarity, because this would only be possible in the case of an alien invasion or an alien threat to the whole of human civilization. And well, when he discusses solidarity in the context of the European Union as one of the pillars, as one of the main European values, he says that basically solidarity denies mutual help and mutual uninterested cooperation between countries in favor of a more self-interested approach. And when he says, for example, when northern countries are showing their solidarity towards poorer southern countries by allowing through cohesion funds to invest in infrastructure and building roads on the Mediterranean coast, for example, this is a very self-interested help, because in the end it benefits the same northern European citizens, which later come on vacation to, for instance, the Spanish coasts. Basically, he says that the Spanish idea of cooperation, for example, cooperation between Spain and her former territories in America, Latin America, would be based not on the idea of solidarity, but instead on the idea of sort of mutual empathy, fraternity, generosity, that kind of things. Well, and talking about the Anglo-Saxon capitalism, I think here I would also mention Bueno's opposition to the English language as the lingua franca on the European territory. He is very skeptical of it, precisely because, I would say, because of his fear of possible dissolution of Spain. And at one point he says that, well, of course, if the dissolution scenario comes to pass, a person from Catalonia, in order to be understood by a person from, let's say, the Basque country, País Vasco, they would eventually talk to each other in English rather than in Spanish. And that is why Bueno sees that there might be an interest on the part of Anglo-Saxon capitalists, as he calls them, in promoting English as being the lingua franca in Europe, and later on what was Spanish territory, eventually, if we consider, of course, the scenario of dissolution. And perhaps I should say a couple of words about Bueno's anti-Americanism. Why is he so disapproving of the United States? Well, first of all, at one point in the book he makes it clear that he sees the US as being interested in occasional conflict on the European soil, just as it happened in the former Yugoslavia. And why does he think so? Well, he thinks that when there is occasional conflict in Europe, the US can sell its arms, its weapons and technologies to Europe on the one hand, and on the other hand it says it is in the interest of the US to appear as a savior that comes to the rescue of Europe when Europe is in need, in the dire straits. And by the way, when I talk about ideas, I have to say that Bueno is very disapproving of American individualism, but on the one hand, and also on the other hand, of mass culture and mass politics. This would be another reason. And in its stead, he says that the Hispanic way of life, well, it would be based on human cooperation in small groups. And the ideal group for him is represented by Don Quixote and Sancho, the famous characters of Miguel de Cervantes' work, but also in small families, small kinship groups. If we return to sort of to history, and to the concept of Spanish Empire, for example, Bueno sees Spanish Empire as fundamentally different from the British Empire, for example. British historiography and the works of John Eliot, you sort of see this opposition between the empire of commerce, which is supposed to be the British Empire, and the empire of territorial conquest, which is supposed to be the Spanish Empire. Sort of two antithetical modes of conducting an empire. Bueno proposes a different dichotomy. In Spanish it will be imperio generador and imperio depredador. So this would be like a predatory empire on the one hand, and sort of civilizing and generating empire. And of course we can guess whose side Bueno is on and which role he reserves for the Spanish Empire. Of course, he thinks that Spanish Empire was a civilizing force, a quintessentially generating empire, as opposed to what he calls the predatory and self-interested British Empire. Something that is quite unusual in Bueno as opposed to other Spanish intellectuals of the time is his skepticism of the idea of European Union and the whole European project itself. He is very critical of it. He sees it as an elitist club. At one point of the book, he is sort of making fun of the unofficial European anthem, the Ninth Symphony, and the idea of harmony and fraternal love and cooperation that this anthem represents. To him, this is all nonsense because he views Europe as essentially as a struggle of all against all, where countries are sort of engaged in eternal competition. And at this point, he introduces the concept of BIOCENOSIS. This is a concept borrowed from the field of biology. And essentially he says, well, in such a system, the system of biocenosis, of course, harmony exists, but the harmony, this harmony is based on the survival of the fittest and of sort of domination and destruction of weaker parties by the stronger parties. This is why Bueno is always seen, and rightly so, as a Eurosceptic. Well, you can see out there in his interviews where he says that, well, Spain has always been in Europe, and when we talk about Spanish integration into the European Union, we do not talk about Spanish integration into Europe, where Spain had been for hundreds of years, but we talk about an elitist capitalist club, and which Bueno obviously is very critical of. So I think one of the most interesting parts of the book to a reader that is not especially familiar with Spanish history and Spanish politics, it is the part where Bueno talks about Latin America, and it is here when he sort of looks into the future and proposes sort of three pathways, three possible scenarios of development for Latin America. The first one is fairly simple. Basically, Bueno says that Latin America can become the backyard of the United States, the source of cheap labor force, that it would be inundated with American culture and propaganda, and eventually English will become sort of lingua franca in Latin American countries, replacing Spanish. The second pathway would be for Latin America to sort of progress more firmly on the path of the so-called ideology of liberation, which was fairly popular in the 1970s, but also earlier, starting with the Cuban Revolution. And obviously this liberation path would be based on the opposition of Latin America both to the United States, but also to Spain as a former colonial empire. And ideologically, it would be based on the rediscovering of sort of pre-Columbian identities of indigenous peoples that lived and still live in Latin America, and the denial of everything coming either from the United States or from Spain. For example, the denial of Spanish Catholicism or sort of Spanish cultural heritage. This would be the second path. And the third path, which Bueno obviously favors, is the path of a more closer integration between Spain and her former territories. He sees this path as mutually beneficial to both parties. On the one hand, Spain would escape from the European Union, which Bueno sees as detrimental to Spanish identity and to Spanish unity. I will talk on that a little bit later. And on the other hand, Latin America would escape from the United States, which Bueno sees obviously as the most dominant modern empire. Bueno sees the solution for the future both for Spain and for Latin American countries in close cooperation and integration, for instance, through cultural initiatives and summits, although at one point he says that this kind of initiatives, this is by no means enough, and he says that the true integration would come only with real sort of economic integration and cooperation between countries on the both shores of the Atlantic. Looking at Spanish, at how Spain developed while she was a member of the European Union, we can ask ourselves why is Bueno so opposed to sort of integration of Spain into the European Union space economically, socially, culturally, and so on. Well, I think this has to do with Bueno's conception of Spanish identity and the relationship of this identity to Spanish unity. And basically, the main thesis that Bueno defends here is that as long as Spain was an imperial force, that is, as long as Spain has this imperial identity, in fact, for Bueno, the identity of Spain is impossible to dissociate it from its status as an imperial power. So the identity of Spain is in itself imperial. And that is why he maintains that as long as Spain was an imperial force, had this imperial identity, it always maintained to preserve its unity. Whereas, for instance, when Spain becomes a part of a larger project as the European Union, it loses its identity, and thereby its unity is being put at risk. Just to conclude, well, in the final chapter, when Bueno has discussed all these topics, and particularly the topic of the relationship between Spanish identity and its unity, Bueno comes to the conclusion that Spain in the future may still have a say in world affairs. And how does he define world affairs? Well, at one point he says that world affairs are the affairs concerning the dichotomies, like, for instance, fascism versus democracy, racism versus humanism, communism versus planned capitalism. But also when he talks about capitalism, he speaks about the division between planned capitalism and liberal capitalism. So this kind of topics, also, for instance, monarchy versus republic, and Bueno sees a role for Spain to play in the future on all these topics, which he sees as concerning the whole of humanity, if Spain manages to sort of maintain its both its unity and its identity. At the end of the video, I think I should say a couple of words about what I see as being some of the shortcomings of this book. I would mention, first of all, the absence of index. Neither of the editions, of the Spanish editions of this book, has an index, which I think it is not a good thing, because throughout the book, Bueno mentions different geographical locations, different historical events, and a lot of names of Spanish intellectuals, philosophers. By the way, there is an extensive bibliography at the end of the book, over, I guess, 100 books and 100 works that Bueno recommends to any scholar that sort of want to understand the idea of Spain, which is the main topic of the book. The fact that there is a bibliography is very good, but the absence of index, of course, makes the reading and the return to this book quite difficult. Well, as I mentioned before, it is conspicuous that throughout his whole discussion of global forces, he never mentions China, although he does mention Russia at one point. He says that there is a Spanish phrase where he says, hasta que Rusia eventualmente vuelva a remontar, which is, I think it can be interpreted that he believes that at one point Russia will become more assertive, as opposed to the late 90s period, which we can see this happening now. As I mentioned before, the criteria he uses when sort of comparing Spain to the Anglo-Saxon peoples and comparing it to the Islamic civilizations are very different. He doesn't base his conclusions on the same criteria, which I think I would also catalog as a shortcoming. But of course, at the end of the day, it is my personal interpretation of the book. I would encourage you, if you are a student of Spanish history, you probably speak Spanish at a decent level, I would encourage you to read at least maybe the final chapter of the book, where Bueno sort of looks into the future This is very interesting. But overall, as I said at the beginning of the video, this book is really very important because of the sheer influence on Spanish intellectual life and current Spanish politicians. I'm sure many of them have read the book. I think that it is a very useful book to sort of understand the Spanish mindset or Spanish nationalist mindset. Although I wouldn't call Gustavo Bueno a hardline Spanish nationalist. In the epoch of Franco, he was labeled as a far-left scholar, but it is very funny to see some recent contemporary developments in Spain when Bueno is rediscovered and he is labeled as fascist, as a far-right ideologue, as a far-right thinker. I think this is all that I can say about this book at this moment. I hope that this video may be of help to you, may be of interest to you. This is sort of my first time making book reviews on YouTube. Yes, I hope you liked it, and I apologize for any, I don't know, sound or video issues that might have appeared. Yes, thank you very much for watching this video, and I will try to come up with more book reviews in what follows.